This lesson, we are going to be showing you how you can create a web app and use it as an endpoint for your JavaScript code, so that way you can request to the URL and then return back responses, both using the get and the post method. These are the values that are coming from the spreadsheet data. So if these get updated and we make the request, it's going to also update within the request values. So we make a request to get, and we can also post to that. So just make sure that it saves within the spreadsheet. And then now we made the request, there's the update. We can also send via post method. So using the doGet and doPost methods within Google Apps Script in order to return back the results that are coming from the query string. So depending on what the value and what the output that we're looking for, we can also select the hard-coded output or a default value, and we can also get the E parameters, and those are all options within the client-side code, and this is just regular JavaScript. So this one is going to be using the object with the get method. This is using the E parameters that are sent in, and we're sending in the type of 3, and it's going to do the same thing for the post and the get, although when we are using the E parameters, the post will have a couple more options there where we've got the content length and so on. So there are differences between the methods when you're making the requests to the web app URL, and then anything outside of 1, 2, or 3 is just going to return back a status of nothing found. I've opened up the script editor, created a new file called get and post. So this is going to be our web app testing application, brand new script file, and starting out with creating a doGet. This is a default function that gets run every time the web app opens, and you can also pass in the E parameters. So if you pass in an argument there, then you can also select that argument and make use of it. So in order to return content from the output, let's first we'll create a variable. I'll just say hello world. So this is going to be the starting value that we're going to output, and every time you've run a web application, you're going to be returning some type of content. So the return statement is a must. Use the content service, and in this case we're going to create text output, and we're going to be using the value that's contained within the variable temp. So once you've created your doGet, that's all you're going to need for the web app, and you're ready to deploy it as a web app. So you can go over to the top right hand side, select the deploy, then select the new deployment. Within the configuration, or select the type, in this case we're making a web app, and then within the configuration, give it a description, select the account that you want to execute as, and because we do want to be able to use the web app as an endpoint to connect from our JavaScript, go ahead and we're going to select anyone. So anyone with this web URL can make a request basically on the doGet. If they open up the URL in the browser, that will allow them to access the content that's being returned, and in this case we're just returning back the variable value there. It does take a few seconds in order to complete the deployment, and once the deployment is ready, then you're going to have a web URL that you can copy and try out. So you can either copy it or you can simply click it. It's going to open it up within a new browser. There's our output that's being output. So right now all we see is hello world being output, and then we can select done. So if we make updates to it, if we do hello world 2, the executable URL is actually not going to change. It's going to stay the same until we either redeploy it, so we can go under the manage deployments, or if we are still within the testing phase, and this is one of the best ways to develop the application. So this is just the developer version, which will have the changes whatever we make within the application. So let's go ahead and we're going to do something with the parameters. We're going to pick up the E parameters and then output those. So instead of outputting it as temp, let's go ahead and we're going to comment that. And using temp, so we're going to assign it to the value that we get back from the E parameters. And we can use another variable for this as well. So this will allow us to have the values within the E parameters. And you can use the JSON method in order to stringify the value from the object, which is the e value. And then we can just simply assign that value to the variable temp. And now when we output it, it's going to have all of the parameters that we have. And right now we don't have any parameters. You can always go back into the test deployments. You can copy the URL, and then you can add in some parameters. So I just set ID equals 1000. So there's our parameters there showing up. So this is a quick and easy way to make use of the content. We can also output it as JSON data. So as we do the JSON stringify, then we can set the meme type, and you can chain that together to the create text output function. And setting the meme type, use the content service, and then meme type, and then whatever meme type you want to set. So this is useful because we want to have the output being able to return back the value directly as we're sending it in. So we want to be able to have a response back and have it as JSON data. So when our JavaScript is connecting, it's going to be able to pick it up as JSON data. So it's not going to be a text value, it's going to be JSON data that we're connecting to. And you can, of course, shorten this quite a bit by having this all within one statement, where we can remove out those two statements, and this will do the same thing, where when we're sending in the variable ID equals 1000, that's what's being returned back. So you have access to all of these parameter values, and if you're actually looking for a particular parameter, then you can also pick up that object information, because this is just an object, just like any other object in JavaScript. So if we were to select, and I'll just bring this back because we're going to make some changes to the value of temp, and for temp itself, if we were to create an object, and this can be any object, it can be an array as well of multiple objects. So just create an object and set that to last, and we can add in some values there. And just like with JavaScript, this is just formatted just as we have regular JavaScript objects. So you don't need to have it as a actual JSON file. And actually I'm going to do first and last. And then we can have multiple objects here because we've got an array wrapping it. So we can have multiple potential usernames within the object. So this is our object. And just as we did with the value of the e parameters, we can also select the object and we can stringify that value. And now the value is going to be outputting that object information. So there's our object information that's now being returned back from our web app. So if this is what we want, we can also have the object coded, or we can get data coming directly from the spreadsheet as well in order to output that, and we can output that as JSON data. So if we do have a spreadsheet, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a spreadsheet and then add in some sample data, and let's insert a row above. So we have headings there, first and last. And now let's select the data. So instead of grabbing it as an object, we can use the spreadsheet app and get the data from the spreadsheet app. So let's select, and we're connected to the spreadsheet service. So using the spreadsheet app class, we want to open by ID, and now let's select the ID of the spreadsheet. So this is the ID of the spreadsheet. And going back into the application, let's add the spreadsheet ID so it's a lot neater as we're selecting it. And then in order to get the sheet object, we already have the spreadsheet content in there, sheet by name, or we can just get all of the sheets if we're not unsure about which one. And we want to select the first sheet of the data. And then in order to get the data from the sheet, we use the get data range, and that returns back the entire data range. Let's also log will output the data. We're going to have to accept permissions because we're asking for new permissions. So let's run the doGet, And this way we can also see the content that we've got coming from the spreadsheet. So we've got an active range. So once we've got the range, if we don't want to do anything else with the range, we can use the get values. And what that will do is that's going to return back all of the values that we have within the spreadsheet. So now that we've got the data, instead of the object being output, we're going to output the contents from the spreadsheet. And this is just going to be the string value of the array that's being output. Let's also do that where we're going to set up, so there's two different types of methods that you can use. So this is a demonstration of the doGet, and then there's also going to be a doPost. And then we're going to also take in the e parameters from there. But typically I do usually like to build it using the doGet, because that way you can use the web URL and see what kind of output you've got there. So let's add in a few other things where we're going to pick up and we're going to see what option and how we want to output the content. And that's going to be a content contained within the e parameters. So that's going to determine whether we're using the object, whether we're using the spreadsheet, or whether we're just outputting the JSON data from the string. And then this way we can control what we've got outputting within the endpoint. So what we want to do is we want to look within the e parameters and see what we want to output. So let's go ahead and we're going to set that variable up and checking to see if, and this is a JavaScript method that you can do in order to check if a value is within the e parameters. And that's going to be the word that we're looking for within the parameters. And we look to see if it's available within the e parameter. And let me just update this once again, that we stringify the e data, and going back out to here. So we have the ID set at 1000. Let's make an update to that and have just numeric options to 1, 2, 3, and 4 if we want, or we can have as many as we want. So I'd put the dev URL and then give it a request value there for type equals 1. And we can see that it's both within the parameter and parameters. So either one, but this one is going to allow for multiple values for type, whereas parameter is just the one value of type. And because we're only expecting to get one value, our conditions are going to be based on one value, this is where we're just going to be checking to see if that is the one value that we want to pick up. So the value itself, well, just give it a variable name of value ID, and then select whatever we've got within the e parameter object with the property name of type. So this will return back the whatever the value is, and in this case it would be a value of 1. That would be where the value of val ID would be. And then now we can apply conditions on that. So if the value of val ID is equal to 1, then we can do something. So the first one, maybe the first value itself is going to be the spreadsheet values. So we can copy what we have here, and I'm just going to shorten this content, and I'll make some values global. So take them out of the function, and I usually uppercase in order to indicate that these are going to be global values instead of local values. And also do the same for the my object, because we don't actually need this value to be sitting within the variable, because now it's going to be global, so we can just access it whenever we need. So those are the two that are out there. We can select the spreadsheet value, and we can just use the global value for ID. And then in order to shorten this, if we're getting the first sheet, that will shrink that. And then if we're just getting the data range, if we're not doing anything else with the sheets, we can really do this within one statement to get the value of data. And also I'm going to set the value of data as a global object. I'll just actually set it blank. So that way, and use const because it's an object. And this way we'll set the value of data vals property to be whatever the spreadsheet. And then let's add in a few other conditions. So the second option is that what we want to do is we want to select from the object itself. So that would mean that the data vals is going to be coming from the object, and the object that we're using is the my object. So we can set that. And then lastly, we want to set data vals to nothing found. So if any of the parameters value, if val ID is 1, we're going to get the spreadsheet data. If val ID is 2, we're going to get the object data. And if we don't have any other value, if the value of ID is 3 or more, or 0, or not 1 and 2, then we're just going to be returning back nothing found. And in order to keep this in a proper structure, let's actually create this within an object. So that way that they're all objects that are being returned back for the data structure. So just give it a status of nothing found. We can now get rid of the rest of the stuff here that we had. And just as we were doing before here for the JSON stringify of the value, here we can select whatever we've got for the data vals. And we can also remove out these two options here, and then just add in the data vals. If you want to add in more options, so let's say we wanted an option for number 3, then the data vals can get the parameter object. So that will be another option that we can output. So now, once we're ready, let's go back and get our test URL, and then set a value of type. So if type equals 1, that's what our output is going to be, nothing found. Let's try if type equals 2. And for some reason it looks like we're not getting a type, and I think that this is probably a string value. So let's do a quick update to it and just make sure that this is checking for a string value, because I was doing the absolutes. So we'll try that again. So the first result is going to return back the object information. Actually, that one's coming from the array, from the sheet array. So that's the data from the sheet array. The second one is coming from the object. And then we did have some more options. So if we set type equals 3, it's going to send us the parameters. So that gives us some more flexibility on what we're outputting. And I'm going to actually do the exact same function for the doPost. And because this is going to be the same function, I'm just going to create it as an output function. And we can take the parameters into the output. Do it this way, where we have the function of output within both the doGet and the doPost. Looks like there was an issue because we're not actually doing the return. So you do need to include this value. So let's set the value of data, and then we're going to return that value of data. So do the same for the doGet and the doPost. So once we get the doGet working, we know the doPost is going to work, as both doGet and doPost do need to have the return in order to make the output work. So now that we've got the doGet and the doPost working, and we can see we are passing the parameters properly, we're ready to do the deployment, and then we're going to connect to it using the web application. And I'll just call this working version 1. Grab the web URL, and let's try out the web URL. So set a type of 1. So that's going to be getting the value for type 1. Open up your developer tools and create a index file. So there's a JavaScript file. I'm going to set a value for the URL. I'm using Visual Studio Code as my editor. And then this is just an index file. So I'm going to actually open this up using the live server. So I have the live server add-on. So there's our JavaScript running. And then we can make a fetch request. And let me just update this. So that means that whenever we press the send, we're going to select the different type and then add that to the request URL. And we've got an area here where we can output the results. Using JavaScript, we're going to select the page elements. So the value for the input, I'll just give it a name of my input. And then of course you can give these variables whatever name you want. selecting from the document, and then the query selector, we're selecting the input. We only just have the one input, so that's fine where we can select the one input. Also selecting the button, we have the button and only just the one button element. If you have more and more inputs, then you're going to be more specific when you're making the selection. And then for the output results, also we only have the one element. And so we have the div, but I believe we probably can use the class, so to be more specific, just in case we add some other divs to the page. So that selects the page elements. Add the event listener to the button. The event that we're listening for is going to be a click, and you can just do this as a function here. So we're getting the click event as the e object, and then within the console log, let's output that the click was successful. Using the dev tools and inspect, go into the console, and then now whenever we click, so we're getting the click being tracked within the event object. That's what we want because we want to select the URL. So getting the value from the my input, and then select the whatever value is currently within the my input, and add that into here, where whenever this value changes, we've got a different value. So that will allow us to make a request to the URL and return back the results. So you can do that within the fetch request, or you can set the URL. So just call it URL1, and then take the value of the first URL, and we're going to add a little bit to it. Those are backticks, so I'm going to be using the template literal. So using the URL value, and then type is equal to whatever we've got for the value of val. And I'll also output this into the console so that we can see that it works. So again, those are not quotes, those are not single quotes, those are the backticks for the template literals, and that's where I'm able to bring in the JavaScript variables in that way. So that gives us the path that we want to request and connect to, and there's the type there at the end. So if we were to open this up, these are going to be different results depending on what the value is that we're passing. So that means that we're ready to make our fetch request, and that fetch is going to go to URL1, and then chaining together the response. So we get the response back from the web URL, and then that response, because it's going to be within a JSON format, then we can return it back as JSON. And the next promise can then use that returned data. And for now, what we'll do is we're going to output that data into the console. So depending on what value we have, we'll have different values and different data that's being returned into the console. So that's 1, that's 2, so that's the object, that's 3, and let's do 4. So 4, just nothing status. So anything but 1, 2, and 3 will return back the nothing status, and that's what we've set within the application. Also, let's add in a second button, and this will do get, and then this one we can do post, so we can actually see the difference between the two. And I'll add in classes to these so that they're easier to select with the JavaScript code, and I'll set those to 2 different lines there, and we're going to use the button 1, and let's update this to button 1, and the second one can be button 2, so in button 2, and we don't actually need the console values. So button 1 was a get event, and button 2, let's update that to do a post. So there's our button 1 result, and let's do a option for button 2, where we're going to be selecting the so the creation of the URL is going to be the same, so that process is the same, and you can also shorten it by doing it this way, or you could keep it, you could even shorten it even more just by putting it directly within the fetch. So that's another option that you have. So for post, it's we can set the method, and the method in this case will be a post, and that should be a colon, not a semicolon. There we've got the post, and we want to include body contents, and the body contents is going to be the form data, and then we're going to get the content from the form data. We're going to create new form data object. And in order to add to the form data, we can do this with JavaScript, where we can add different items into the form data. So for now, let's test the post out. So it's giving us those. Let's update this to output the results. So create a function. I'll just call it outputter, and can also call it data or values, just to make it different. And this time I'll just send it into the outputter, and we will also do the console log of vals, so we know what we sent to the outputter. Select the page element that we've got as results, and set the text content using the JSON stringify. Let's stringify the result for vals. So the get should just be within the console, and then the post is going to be outputting here. And notice that even though we're posting, the parameters are still there. Let's add to the form data. Select the form data. Let's add some more parameters to it. You can use the append method to the form data that's just been created. Let's give it a value there within the object. So a key value, and then the value. So this is actually going to be the key. Let's call it key 1 and value 1. So now we've got within the parameters, we've got the values there of key 1, and within the parameters, we've got the array. So we are able to distinguish, and the query type still comes in as type 3. So that's still going to work because we're passing it and setting it within the URL. So within the query string, we've still got the values, and they're still working within post. You can also set the value of type within the form data, and then that's going to override the query string. And if you want to update, so we can also update what we've got for the output of the get method. And this way they're both going to be doing the same, where they're still outputting the content. And here within the data, you can add to the object and do the same, where to the data, let's add the method that we were using. So we always get that value that's being output, that we can actually see the type down here. And there we've got the type of get. You can also pass that separately into the outputter function in order to make sure. So we can get the type there, and then instead of having a separate line of code there, adding it to the data, we set it as a value. And then this can be added to the vals, and set the type to val. And just make sure that we are picking up the value properly. So we've got the type within the object there. And because these are arrays, that's why we're not able to see. So a better way to output the result is, and this isn't going to be within an array format, so we can always add to the text content and add a new line for the val, which is a much more efficient way to do this. So just call it sent method, and then here we can add in the val. So that way there's always a value there for the sent method, and we know whether we've done a get or a post of the output. So when you are trying to troubleshoot your Google Apps script, and you are trying to create an endpoint, application endpoint, the best way to go is to first develop it with the doGet, and that way you can use the dev tool within the app script in order to try it out and just make sure it works. And once you've got the code working, the response working, then you can use the doPost, And a lot of times this will avoid the problems when you're getting the CORS issue. And CORS typically is something with the code. It can also be permissions. So it is difficult to troubleshoot. So this way, as you're developing using the doGet, you can easily see the responses back and then update them accordingly.